This is a production of Cornell University.
Thank you so much for attending today. I am really excited to present on this topic because one, I'm passionate about this. I believe this will help you in your careers. It will help you anywhere you go in your life because presentation skills are skills that you can use anywhere in any type of job that you get into. Also, there are basic communication skills a lot of times, and then just persuading somebody to do something. The things that I'm presenting here, I've actually used in several areas. One of the areas that I actually used was for a personal friend. So I was trying to convince him to go to Switzerland with me, and he did not want to go. He didn't like traveling internationally, but I know that he did like some things. And so I went to my presentation skills, and I thought, how do I persuade him to go with me? So I put together an actual presentation, and I emailed it to him, and I convinced him, actually after 10 years, to go to Switzerland with me. So not only in business, but your personal life, you can use this also. So let's get into this. All right. It's estimated that there are 30 million business presentations given every single day. Unfortunately, what a lot of those presentations, all they do is to convince the audience that they had wished they'd never had attended the presentation in the first place. So I'm going to give you some tips on how to avoid that, how not to put your audience to sleep, but more importantly, to be able to convince them to take action. Warren Buffett. How many people have heard of Warren Buffett? Raise your hand. Arguably, he's one of the most successful investors in history. Now, Warren Buffett said that you can improve your value by 50% by learning communication skills or presentation skills. Now, Mr. Buffett has a single certificate on his wall in his office. And what it is, I'll give you a hint, it's not his business certificate, his business degree. It's from a class that he took on presentation skills at the beginning of his career, a Dale Carnegie class. And while I couldn't get Mr. Buffett to personally endorse my class or presentation, I'm sure that he would laud your efforts to increase your presentation or communication skills. MBA programs have long understood and the value of presentation skills. So Chicago and Stanford and Harvard, Wharton, Columbia, and Berkeley Haas, and many other MBA programs have included presentation skills in their programs. Now, one of the unfortunate things is that people are deathly afraid of presentations. In fact, there was a study done by Harvard Business School where they asked people, would you rather give a 5-minute presentation or for 5 minutes have electric shocks put through your wrist? Guess what most people chose? They chose to have electric shocks put through their wrist. In another study, people were asked, what is your biggest fear? Presentation, giving a speech was number 1. Death didn't even make the list. So Jerry Seinfeld said, if you're at a funeral, most people would rather be in the coffin than giving the eulogy. So I'm going to help you to, again, get over some of the fears by giving you the tools and techniques to become a more confident presenter. You can have the greatest idea in the world, but if you cannot persuade enough people, it doesn't matter. Science, even math, the most logical of endeavors, is a social activity. What happens if somebody has a new theory? What do? They go and tell their colleague, hey, what do you think about this? And then it's published and it's peer reviewed. And it's a social type of activity. We have to convince others that our ideas have value and merit. And if we can't, an idea may just fail. So this is for the online presentation. So now, people feel free to enter into the chat window some of the challenges that you face. But for the audience that's here in the room, what are some of the challenges that you face when preparing presentation content? Just shout it out. Yeah.
The balance between overwhelming my presentation or underwording my presentation.
Sorry, what was that?
To find a balance between overwording my presentation slides and underwording them.
Okay, so
Wording or underwording.
overwording and underwording, yes. Okay, what's another one? What's another challenge that you face when preparing a presentation? Yes,
The audience knowledge, like fitting my presentation to the audience.
the audience knowledge, absolutely, extremely important. I think there was another hand up over here.
The time.
Time? Yes.
The length of the
Okay, how much that you have? One person said, I would have prepared a shorter presentation, but I didn't have enough time. Preparing a short presentation often takes more time than a longer one. Yes.
What kind of visual aids you use?
What type of visual aids that you use? Absolutely. Yes.
linking topics or slides.
Okay, yes, the transitions between different topics, all the, yeah, very, very valid things. Well, I'm going to talk to you about Aristotle and his ideas behind persuasion. Aristotle was a philosopher that lived 2,000 years ago, and he had thoughts on the three most important aspects of what makes a persuasive argument. And science has actually validated a lot of those ideas since that time. And the three ones that he really believed were important were in Greek, ethos, pathos, and logos, or credibility, emotion, and logic. And he believed that you had to have three components of a persuasive argument, and you needed to have all three. So I'm going to go and talk about each one of those components and how they fit into a persuasive argument. Now, I have to tell you, my background is in computing science, and I really thought that this is all that mattered, logic, your data. And as long as you had enough data and you had a logical argument, you could convince anybody of anything. And it took me over 20 years to actually get myself off of that and realize that emotion is really important, and establishing credibility is also really important. So to prepare a persuasive presentation, you need to be able to establish your credibility. I'm going to talk about making it memorable with structure, and then the power of story. So let's talk about each one of those. First of all, let's talk about credibility, establishing credibility. Well, for establishing credibility, you need to provide your credentials up front. Give your audience a reason on why they should believe you. And this is really important up front, because if you do convince your audience that you are believable and credible, that makes the rest of the presentation that much easier. Now, you could establish credentials up front for yourself, or maybe it's your group, or maybe your company, whatever it might be, but establishing credibility is really important. So giving your audience a reason to listen to you. And generally, you want to spend the least amount of time to get the job done. If you spend too much time, you come off egotistical. Oh, look at me, I'm so great. But you do want to establish credibility. So here's some ways that you can do that. And remember that results are more important than experience. I can say, yeah, I have 30 years of experience, but more importantly, results. If you can tell people what results that you've gotten in the past, that's more important than experience. Okay, so here's an example of what I do. It takes me 30 seconds at the beginning of my classes that I teach. I teach classes on presentation skills at Western Digital and outside. I say, my name is Justin Strong. I have 30 years of presentation experience. I'm an instructor and author of presentation skills at Western Digital, and my classes typically get 4.9 out of 5 stars. 30 seconds, I'm done. Then I'm off to the rest of my presentation. So I do have experience here, but more importantly, results. People say, oh, wow, other people have really enjoyed your class and they've gotten a lot out of it. Perfect. Okay, so that's what I do. So your credibility statement is going to look a little bit different than that. However, you do need to establish your credibility, hopefully at the beginning of your presentation. And people will see you more credible if somebody else refers to you as an authority on the subject. And it turns out that that person doesn't necessarily need to be an expert themselves. So there was a study done at a real estate office where the receptionist would answer the phone in one of two ways. The first way was, I'll put you through to Mary. She is one of our real estate agents. And the second way was just slightly different. She said, I'll put you through to Mary. She has 20 years of experience selling homes. Now, the receptionist is hardly an expert on real estate agents. However, just that one small change resulted in 20% more appointments and 15% more signed contracts. So if you could get somebody to introduce you at the beginning of your presentation and refer to you as an expert in the subject and however you want to establish your credibility, that will definitely help. Okay, I'm going to skip this one over. Let's go on to the next one, which is logic. Okay, this is the one I think of, and I still think of when I first, what data do I have? What logical arguments do I have? Well, one of the things that you want to do is provide structure to your logic. So here's an example of a presentation where it had a really good structure. Now, Steve Jobs is one of my heroes. He is what I feel is one of the best product managers that had ever lived. I'm a product manager at Western Digital, and I kind of view him as one of the product manager heroes. Now, his iPhone introduction, the first presentation when they first revealed the iPhone, was considered one of the best business presentations. And here's some of the reasons why. He had a structure in his presentation, and a structure kind of went like this. First, he presented what is. So he talked about all of the phones that existed at that time. There was a BlackBerry, I think a Nokia, there was a Palm Trio, and let's see, there was a Motorola, right? Those were the phones that existed at that time. And he said, well, you know, they have some problems with them. They have a fixed keyboard. They have a fixed keyboard. They have a screen that's relatively small, and they're not really very easy to use. And they have a stylus that is difficult and that you always lose it. He said, but what if you had a large screen that took up the whole phone and you didn't have a fixed keyboard? You didn't have to worry about a stylus that you could lose, and everything just worked together like magic. So he said, what's the current situation? What could be? What if you had this? And then he introduced the solution, the iPhone. So very simple structure in his presentation, but really served as a way to describe his solution to the audience. There's lots of different structures that you could use, but the point is here is that when you have a logical argument in data, when you put it into a structure, it's easier for your audience to remember. In fact, there was a Stanford study that said people are 40% more liable to remember data that's structured rather than unstructured. Okay, so that is, so the structure that he used is what is, but what if, and here's my solution. You can use this in a lot of your presentation. Here's the current situation, the problem that we face, but what if we didn't have to deal with those problems? And then you have your audience ready for your solution. Now, a lot of times what people do is they'll put the solution up front. And that's certainly a valid way of presenting, but this is also a very interesting and good way because it sets your audience up to really want your solution because they identify with the problems that you're telling them. And you say, hey, what if you didn't have to deal with those problems? And they're like, yes, how can you solve that? And so then you present your solution. So here's an example structure. You would do your opening and let's say 5 reasons why cloud storage will double over the next 3 years. We're the global cloud storage leader, and then your closing. So that's another structure that you can use. You have your opening, you've got 5 reasons why your particular proposal is true. And then you're telling your audience, hey, we're the global cloud storage leaders. And then you have your closing, which which may contain a call to action to ask your audience, hey, check out our website if you think that you'd like to use our cloud storage solution. Another thing you want to do is make your data relevant to your audience. There was a comment at the beginning on, hey, how do I make sure that my audience will understand what I'm talking about? So one of the things you want to do is make your data relevant to your audience. Well, here's an example how to do that. So let's say that you work for a solar company, a company that produces solar panels. And you said, our company saved 1 billion kilowatt of hours of electricity in the United States. Well, if you're not part of the solar industry, you might say, what's a kilowatt hour? And is a billion very much? Is it 1% of all? You may not know if you're in the industry, but if you couch it in different terms, you say our company saved 15 minutes of all of the electricity consumption in the United States. Now, all of a sudden, even if your audience is not in the electricity or solar power energy industry, they're going to understand that. So you want to ensure that, one, you want to understand who you're talking to. Now, if you're talking to members of your audience who are in your particular profession, then it's okay to use technical language. And this may be perfectly valid. But if you have members of your audience who aren't in your particular industry, or you don't know, this may be a lot easier for your audience to relate to. So if you make data relevant to your audience, they're going to be able to understand it a lot easier and then relate to what you're saying. So those are a couple of suggestions when you have logic and data to present to your audience, how you can make it easier for your audience to consume it. One, put it into a structure. Two, make data relevant to your audience. Now, there's a lot of other techniques and tools. I teach a 2-day class in my company, and we only have less than an hour here. So I gave you a couple of principles, but there's certainly a lot more that you could do. But those are two principles that definitely will help you to make your logical arguments more relevant to your audience. So number 3, emotion, the last one. So this is the one that I struggled with a lot of times, because one, I thought, isn't this just manipulating your audience, right, with emotion? You know, when you see those ads for starving kids in Africa, and then you see them, and you're just, I thought people are just manipulating your emotions. But I really have changed my thinking then and realized that emotion is an integral part of our decision-making process. And in fact, it's an integral part of us taking action on any argument that we hear. I'll talk about the science behind that. So data leads us to conclusions, but emotion leads us to action. Data leads us to conclusions, but emotion leads us to action. So Antonio Damasio is a social scientist, and his specialty is decision-making and emotion. He's done a lot of research on that. And one of his most interesting experiments were with people whose emotional part of their brain was not functioning. These people could not feel any emotion at all. Now, you would think that they would be the best decision makers. They would make totally logical decisions. They would be like Spock and not have to be impacted by their emotions. Well, it turned out the exact opposite was the case. That those people whose emotional part of their brain was damaged and they couldn't feel any emotion at all could not make any decisions at all. They couldn't decide what to wear in the morning. They couldn't decide what to eat for breakfast. They couldn't decide what shoes to put on. And when Antonio asked the subjects in this experiment, hey, what's going on? How come you can't make any decisions? They said, well, we know what we should do. We just can't bring ourselves to do it. So data leads us to conclusion, but emotion will lead us to take action. So that's data. Well, what do we do with it, right? Do you want to make your audience cry in every presentation that you have, or make them laugh or whatever? Well, not really, no. But there is a way that you can bring out emotions in your audience that are perfectly valid and are not manipulative. And one of the best ways to do that is through storytelling. Storytelling will elicit emotions in people in a non-manipulative way and help them to take action. We are born storytellers and story listeners. In fact, we used to use stories to transmit vital information that we needed to survive. We used to transmit information. People would sit around the fire at night and tell each other how they survived during a drought, or what happened when the herds went away and they had to find new places to live. And that storytelling is how we transmitted vital information that we needed. So we are wired for storytelling. So how do we use that in a business environment? Well, I didn't believe in the power of storytelling until one day I had to give a presentation. I had been on a business trip to the UK, and I'd been there for a month. And we were working with the largest cellular phone provider in Europe. And we were working on a project with them. And I was there for a month and helping them with the implementation and the project. And then I came back on a Friday. I was back in the office on a Friday, and Friday morning, my boss came to me and said, the executives want you to present what your findings were. They want you to talk about what results that you got. I was a little bit nervous because while we had some achievements, we didn't really have a lot of data to present. And I had presented to the executives before I left, and I put business case after business case together, showing what return on investment that we would get. However, before I went, I knew that our project was at risk of being defunded. So I was really nervous. I didn't really have any new data to present, and I really believed that you should really make data-based decisions. And I really didn't have a lot of new data to present, but I did have some stories to present. So they wanted, I had to do it. I couldn't refuse. And so I went into the presentation with all the executives, and I told stories about how the customer was happy about what we were doing, about how they had some successes in some of the areas. And I finished the presentation and I thought, well, okay, I guess, whatever will happen, will happen. Monday morning, I came in, my boss goes, Justin, congratulations. And I go, what? Yeah, the executives want to fully fund your product. Like, why? I didn't present any new data. All my business cases, they were lukewarm responses to them. And yet I told stories, and now all of a sudden they want to fully fund the product. And honestly, it took me years after that to really comprehend the power of story. And it wasn't until I had done research on the power of story and then thought back to that experience and I had my aha moment. Oh, stories really do have power to lead people to take action. I had the data. Now, don't get me wrong, data is extremely important. You need that. But you also need stories to help bring it to life and to lead your audience to take action. Richard Branson, how many people have heard of him? He is the CEO of Virgin Enterprises. He said, regardless of the medium, there is nothing more effective and affecting than storytelling. Every year, he brings his top executives to his private island, Necker Island, and they gather around a virtual fire and they tell stories about their business and how their successes and failures, and he really believes in that power. Jerome Bruner is an educational researcher. He says, when you have data that's couched in a story, people are 22 times more likely to remember it. 22 more times likely to remember data that's in a story than not. Well, in the analysis of TED Talks, 500 TED Talks, somebody did an analysis of 500 TED Talks. Actually, it was Carmine Gallo. He's a very famous speaker, and he wrote a book called The Storyteller's Secret. And he did an analysis of 500 TED Talks. And he looked at the percentage of those talks that were emotion, story, data, and credibility. So what percentage of it was involved with storytelling or emotion, data, and credibility? Well, I'm just going to go through. Well, 65% was data, emotion, and storytelling. Oh, before I go any further, how many people have not heard of TED Talks? Okay, I just want to make sure. I know it's, but some audience that I talked to, some people haven't heard of it. 25% was data, and 10% was credibility. TED Talks are considered, I think, in a lot of people's career, the pinnacle of presentations. If you get invited to do a TED Talk, you're considered one of the best storytellers or presenters in the world. And so the world's best presenters, 65% of their presentations are storytelling or emotion. Let me give you another example. I work for a company called Western Digital. We make hard drives, and we own the company called SanDisk, which makes flash memory cards. We're totally data driven. Now, if I went to, let's say I was doing a customer presentation and I said 65% of consumers lost data from a computer or mobile device in 2019. Now, that's data. It leads you to conclusions. Wow, that's terrible. Yeah. But what if I added a story to that and said, my hard drive failed last year and I lost all the photos from the first 3 years of my children's life. Just imagine how upset my wife was. My wife laughs because this has some truth to it. But now you tell a story, and now people are like, oh, I don't want that to happen. I need to find a solution. What solution do you have? So data leads you to conclusions, but a story, and this is a very short story, but would lead you to take action, because now you see how it applies to you. So data leads you to conclusions, storytelling or emotion leads you to action. Again, you need both. Now, can you tell an effective story in 2 sentences? Again, another kind of personal story. My wife came to me and said, hey, we should get an Apple TV. And then the next sentence, wait, what is an Apple TV anyway? Well, that's the power of brand. She was so enamored with Apple products that Apple and TV, I had to have one, even though she had no idea what it did. So yes, you can tell an effective story in just a couple of sentences. You don't have to have long stories. In fact, you don't have to have a story that's really exciting or overwhelming to your audience. But if it's sincere and it's relevant to the topic that you're talking about, it can be effective. And that's one of the things you have to remember when you choose a story. It has to be related to the topic that you're talking about. Some stories are great, but maybe great for another presentation and not this one. Okay, so in summary, we have 3 aspects to a persuasive presentation. And to have a really persuasive one, you want to have all 3. You want to have, of course, your data and your logic. You want to establish your credibility up front. And then ideally have some type of a story within your presentation. Star, how are we doing for time?
It's, yeah, if you can finish, that's great. 1 minute, yeah.
1 minute?
Yeah.
Okay. That's fine. I will wrap up. Okay, so one of the things that I do also, and this is, I'm going to use 1 minute to talk about this, is that I use a content development worksheet, and I'll send this to you so that you can look at this. I use what I call content development worksheet for every presentation that I do. I did it for my friend's presentation. I did it when I had to do a eulogy last year for my best friend. Every presentation. So what is it? What does it contain? First of all, you want to know who your audience is and what do they care about. Your outcomes. What do you want your audience to know as a result of your presentation? And what do you want them to do? Then there's your supporting material. So this is your logic, this is the meat of your presentation, your topics, and I have a reminder here, use emotion, logic, and credibility. So this is, and you want to have a structure in this area. This is where you have your structure. And then finally your opening, and this may sound counterintuitive, but I do my opening after I do all this material. Capture your attention of your audience, establish your credentials, and then your closing, summarize, and have a call to action. What is it that you want your audience to do as a result of your presentation? Don't forget to leave this out. Almost always you should have some type of thing that you want your audience to do. And it may just be go to my website, read my paper, take a look at this data, whatever it is. But you should have something. Otherwise, what's the point of the presentation? You want your audience usually to do something. Okay, well, thank you so much for listening. This is part of the content development worksheet that will let you there. So here's your assignment, my call to action for your next presentation. 1, add a story to your next presentation. You might find this difficult, but I found that if I really look, there's a story in almost every presentation, even if it's very, very technical. Establish your credibility at the beginning of your presentation. And number 3, use the content development worksheet. And again, we'll send it out to you so that you have a copy of that. All right. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Justin. All right. So for people on the line, also in the room, I did a terrible job in establishing Justin's credibility by introducing him, but that was not accident. Okay, it's intentional. I'm going to do the assignment. I'm going to tell your story. All right. Okay, that's my assignment, to tell a story. I was struggling with persuading my audience. I do too much data. That's the feedback from many, many people, including maybe Kelly and Ed and many, many people. So I thought, what I'm going to do? Okay, so I did an EMBA last 2 years while doing my full-time job. So I graduated in May. After that, I felt they taught me how to handle the data, all the analytics. I took the digital transformation, this and that, didn't really help me to be more effective in persuading people. Then what I did was this summer, I joined a cloud called Career Bootcamp, where I met Justin, and he taught about this seminar. And as he mentioned, yeah, so the persuasive, take action. I was persuaded, so I took action. I emailed him, and I thought I could invite him to talk to all of you on Zoom. He's from California, okay, working in Western Digital. And how sincere he is. He's here in person. All right, so hopefully you have a wonderful learning, and now time for your questions, okay? Anyone, yeah. Before I tell you more story, because I have a lot to share, okay? Wow. Come to Toastmaster, maybe I do a plug there, okay? So in addition to the on Zoom open everywhere, yeah, locally, we also have Toastmaster Club, public speaking. So as students, faculty, and other people from Cornell, outside Cornell, we are very diverse, age, profession, yeah. It's helped me to be comfortable here. Oh yeah, Kelly.
I guess a quick question out of curiosity, right? So I feel like I'm sort of so tied to like using PowerPoint and kind of sort of these standard ways of putting together PowerPoint presentations. You know, as someone that specializes in this, do you have any recommendations of other ways of putting together a presentation that's maybe not so PowerPoint reliant?
Yeah, how you, instead of PowerPoint? Yeah, well, it really depends on the presentation. So a lot of presentations, if you listen to TED Talks, some of the talks don't have any slides at all. And that's perfectly valid. Slides, though, if you do have them, should support you as the presenter. You are the star of the show, not your slides. The slides should be supporting you and should be showing some information, but you are the person that they have come to listen to. Otherwise, you can just take your slides and just watch them at home. So make sure that if you do have slides, that they are supporting you and not the focus of the presentation. You should always be the focus of the presentation. So you can have a perfectly valid presentation without any slides. Now, as far as, are there other options other than slides where you can have a presentation? Well, sure. One would be to have some type of an object or objects that you bring up, and you can have a combination of slides and objects that you have in your presentation. I've used different techniques within PowerPoint and Zoom. There's actually one. Star, did you attend the presentation on how to present like a broadcaster?
Yeah.
Okay, so what I did is that there is capability within Zoom to take your PowerPoint presentation and put it as a background. So what I did is I created a virtual broadcasting studio in PowerPoint. I put a suit on. I got myself situated and looked like I was actually behind a desk in a presentation in a broadcast studio. And I gave my presentation that way. So if you look into PowerPoint and Zoom, look into a feature. It's a beta feature, I think, in Zoom on using PowerPoint as a background. And so you can use PowerPoint. And so you kind of are almost immersed in the presentation itself. Also within, I don't know if you use Teams at all here or, yeah, so in Teams, you can present, there's different presenter views where you actually bring yourself into the middle of the presentation or on the side, and your slides are right beside you. And I like to do that because it, instead of just being a little boxed onto the side, you actually are in your presentation right next to your slides. So that's another way that you can bring yourself and bring yourself front and center rather than present, I call it presenting outside of the box, right? And you're actually more of a part of the presentation. So I don't know if I fully answered your question, but there's a couple of things, there's a few things that you can do. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for that presentation, which I find timely because I was just contemplating presentation that I have to give.
Okay.
Is what,
Yeah.
I appreciate the tips that you're providing. But I feel like my questions are almost for the group because I'm
Sure.
trying to interpret a couple of things and wondering how they would be. Maybe Star is really a good person to help with this. Like, what is a call to action in our science topics? So you're gonna, you say you're a grad student or postdoc, you're giving your research topic. Like, what would be appropriate to regard as being in the call to action? That's one thing. And even like, what are story? How do we interpret the word story in the
Right.
kind of work that we actually do? Now, I'm not saying that's that hard a question, but it's still,
Mhm.
I'd love some
Yeah.
examples of what kind of would count or be powerful in that in
Right.
our context. And I don't
Yeah.
know if you're the right person to answer.
Well, let me answer one of your questions that you had, and this is what I get from a lot of people within who are in engineering and finance. And they say, there's no story to us, there's just numbers. I'm saying you can always find a story. So one example is, let's say that you're presenting the end of the quarter numbers. And it's just, okay, we made $40 million and we achieved, and we had a $10 million profit. Okay, well, yeah, those are just numbers. And so I have finance people that tell me, how do I put a story in? There's no story behind it. Well, no, there always is. So here's an example. You say today, and last week, I went to the CFO and I told him, hey, guess what? I've got an envelope sitting on this desk. And in it is our end of the quarter numbers. Guess what they were? And he goes, I think it was about 35 million. No. And then a little bit higher. 38 million. No, higher. It's more than 38? Yeah. About 39. No, it was 40 million. Now, very simple story, right? And you might think, well, it probably doesn't have a lot of meaning, but when you couch a number in a story, people are more likely to remember that number. Remember that statistic where Jerome Bruner said you're 22 more times likely to remember a number if it's couched in a story? Well, if I told the story like that, and how more likely do you think that people are to remember the 40 million number than if I just said, oh, here's our numbers, we got $40 million of revenue, and we achieved $10 million in profit. So very simple story. And again, your stories don't have to be complicated and overly dramatic. They can be a very simple story, but if they're sincere and if they're related to the topic that you're talking about, it could be a struggle that you had in getting some of the data. It could be a funny incident that happened. But if you take your data and wrap it in some type of a story, your audience is going to remember it more. And that's one of the things that you want to do. The sad truth is that probably about 50% of your presentation and more will be forgotten within 24 hours. So that's one of the challenges that you have as a presenter. How do you get your audience to remember what you said for a longer period of time? And stories are definitely one way to do that.
How about the call to action?
Yeah, call to action. Well, I think I've turned to the audience to say, hey, what are some suggestions that people might have? Because I think they would probably know that better than me. I'm not the subject matter expert in what you're talking about. Yes.
So I thought of a call to action as, you conclude the presentation, but then you talk about the next steps. And to add emotion, you would add the impact of, what doing those next steps would mean for your subject.
So it's kind of your call to action to yourself. Is that right? Is that count?
To the audience,
That can be, yes.
depends on the audience,
Yeah, I would agree with the call to action as next steps makes a lot of sense because it can be a call to action for yourself, but also especially as students who generally will have like a small part of the project, the call to action is to your field and saying like, this is what I've added and these would be the next logical steps with the encouragement that you hope that someone else will take on the research and help develop your ideas further.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it might be, hey, does anybody have any suggestions on these?
Yeah, I can try to.
Standing.
Yeah,
Right?
Rebecca.
These are things that we don't know what to do. I'd like to have people suggest, some things that we could, maybe some directions that we could take. There could be several different things, I think. Or if you want people to go to your website, a website, or to a paper or something to get more information, that could be it, right? Hey, if you're interested, this is where you go for more information. And that's one thing I always do is that for more information, here's where you go.
Yeah. So Rebecca, one thing I can think of is why the power of social media. Yeah, you can see it's rising. I think it's a part of once personally you want to take action and through your own posting, your own blogging, that can really get a lot of people really see the impact on themselves. So it's more powerful than you even send a real publication proposal sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, Chris.
Justin, in terms of credibility, you talk about storytelling and then injecting that in your presentation can add value. But in terms of credibility, if it's a story that you're sharing that you directly yourself experience versus maybe telling a story that you heard about that somebody else, is there a fine line there? Is there a difference? Does it matter in terms of credibility?
Well, for credibility, you mean whether people will believe like a story that somebody else?
Not so much believe, but just in terms of adding that value, that credibility to your
Sure,
speech. Does it carry more weight
Oh,
if you yourself
Yeah.
experience versus somebody else?
Okay, so there's a couple different aspects to that. Certainly a personal story is usually of more interest to the audience when you tell a story of something that happened to you personally, especially if you're talking about something where you want to convince your audience to do something and you can tell a story about how you have been impacted by it yourself. So I told a story about how I was impacted by storytelling and how it impacted me. Now, if I told a story about somebody else, I think that's perfectly valid. That is, but I think there's something a little bit different and a little bit more impactful when you tell a story about that's personal and what actually happened to you. So both are definitely very valid. Sometimes you can't find you don't have a story yourself, right? A personal story. So it's definitely very valid to use, and I think can be really, really impactful if you tell a story that is related to your presentation, but somebody else experienced it.
Yeah. So for the people on the line, if you have a question, I'd like to give you one chance. Okay. Yeah. The last question is for the people on the line. Anyone?
Yes.
Just unmute yourself.
Or send it through the chat.
Okay. Yeah. So if not, there's still more time. So Justin's going to meet graduate students for lunch. So graduate students are not continue on the conversation. All right. So let's give one more round of applause to Justin. Thank you, Justin. Yeah. So what I really think, Justin, the value he brings is from very technical background, computer science. I felt his worksheets, also all the techniques, tools is very easy to follow. Yeah. So 3 things to be persuasive. I think we can all replicate. Yeah, just multiply. All right. And if you see this as value, we can definitely invite Justin back online or in person in the future. We can continue on. Okay, with that, please join the lunch with Justin. Thanks.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.